Welcome to the third presentation on Charles Darwin's visit to Australia. This presentation covers the 6 days of Darwin's inland trip to Bathurst. From Darwin's diary. I hired a man and 2 horses to take me to Bathurst, a village about 120 miles in the interior and the centre of a great pastoral district. By this means I hope to get a general idea of the country. Although Sims Covington had accompanied Darwin on similar inland excursions earlier in the Beagle's voyage, it seems that Darwin felt that he needed someone with local knowledge for this journey. No one has yet been able to discover the identity of Darwin's companion on this trip. In a letter written to his sister Susan when he was back in Sydney, Darwin says, "My object was partly for geology, but chiefly to get an idea of the state of the colony and see the country. Large towns all over the world are nearly similar, and it is only by such excursions that the characteristic features of a country can be perceived." This is the new notebook that Darwin started in Sydney when he commenced his trip to Bathurst. 16th, Saturday. Left Sydney, soon entered country. Excellent roads, turnpike, pothouses, that is, pubs. Too much woodland, some fine trees, all peculiar, referring of course to the eucalyptus trees, which were peculiar to someone from England. Rails instead of hedges, many carts, gigs, phaetons and horses. The first day took Darwin to Parramatta for lunch and on to Emu Ferry on the east bank of the Nepean River by the end of the day, a distance of 34.5 miles. On the road between Sydney and Parramatta, Darwin notes in his diary that there was a most close resemblance to England. Perhaps the number of pothouses was here in excess. The first stage took us through Parramatta, a small country town, but second to Sydney in Australia. Here is an 1838 Conrad Martin's painting of Parramatta, viewed from the eastern side of the settlement, looking west. The waterway is the Parramatta River, which becomes the western part of Sydney Harbour. This line of road is of course the best and longest time inhabited in the colony. And here we have a Martin sketch of the road between Parramatta and Emu Ferry, drawn 2 weeks before Darwin rode along that same road. I slept at night at a very comfortable inn at Emu Ferry, which is 35 miles from Sydney. In the 1835 New South Wales Calendar and General Post Office Directory, there is a mention of the Emu Ford, a ferry on the Nepean, at which there is the Governorburg Inn, kept by Mr. Wilson, where there is excellent accommodation. The inn had been opened in 1826. Over the decades it went through many owners and rebuildings, including becoming the Log Cabin Inn in 1939. Sadly, everything was destroyed by fire in 2012. 10 years later, a new hotel, retaining the name the Log Cabin, was opened adjacent to the site of the Governorburg Inn. Here's a photo of the entrance to the new hotel, and here's a blow-up of the sign, reminding us that there has been a hotel here since 1826. "17th. Early in the morning we crossed the Nepean in a ferry boat. Here is a Martin sketch of the Emu Ferry, dated 15th of May 1835, indicating that Martins came out here within a few weeks of arriving in the colony. The view is from the eastern side of the river, that is the location of the Governorburg Inn, looking west. Amazingly, the ferry was just a few planks of wood strung together, pulled along via a rope that spanned the river. According to the New South Wales Calendar and General Post Office Directory, 1835, the dues payable were 2d for every foot passenger and 6d for every horse, mare, gelding, ass or mule, with double tolls demandable on Sundays. Since January the 17th was a Sunday, and since Darwin's party consisted of 2 men and 2 horses, the total cost to Darwin was 2 shillings and 8d. How anyone was ever brave enough to take a horse on such a vessel remains a mystery. Here is that same Martin's view compared with the view of the same scene in 1986. In both images you can see the roadway on the west bank sloping up from the river. The only thing missing from the 1986 view is the ferry. And here's a photo taken in 2023, looking slightly downstream. There are now many more trees on the west bank, and a huge pedestrian and cyclist bridge called the Yandai Nepean Crossing, opened in 2018, now spans the river, just a bit downstream from where the ferry used to cross. Here's a modern map showing the site of the Governor Burke Inn, the adjacent new log cabin hotel, the route of the Emu ferry, and the new pedestrian cycle bridge. Having crossed the Nepean River, Darwin followed what was then the main road over the Blue Mountains up to the Weatherboard Inn, where he had lunch, finishing up at Blackheath, another ride of 34.5 miles. You can see that soon after crossing the Nepean River on the Emu ferry, Darwin went through Mitchell's Pass. The ascent is not steep, the road having been cut with much care along the side of some sandstone cliffs. And here is a Martin's painting of Mitchell's Pass, painted just a few months before Darwin's visit, showing what Darwin describes as the road having been cut along the side of some sandstone cliffs. The bridge in the centre, the Lennox Bridge, is the oldest bridge on the Australian mainland. Both the road and the bridge were opened in 1833, just 3 years before Darwin's trip. These days, the main highway, shown as the solid grey line in the lower half of this image, no longer includes Mitchell's Pass. Indeed, Mitchell's Pass is now a one-way road from west to east, that is, coming down from the Blue Mountains. So it is still possible to drive down Mitchell's Pass Road from west to east if you are coming back from the Blue Mountains. The secret is to turn left at McDonald's in Blacksland and follow the Mitchell's Pass signs. There are parking places at the Lennox Bridge where you will be surrounded by the scene shown in Martin's painting. It's a perfect spot to experience the serenity of Australian bushland. In the middle of the day, we baited our horses at a little inn called the Weatherboard. This map shows the site of the Weatherboard Inn, not far from the Wentworth Falls railway station. Here's a photo of an evergreen oak that was planted in 1936 to mark the centenary of Darwin's visit. About 1.5 miles from this place, there is a view exceedingly well worth visiting. Here we have a map that incorporates the Weatherboard Inn at the top, extending to the south to what Darwin describes as the view exceedingly well worth visiting, just past Weeping Rock. Here's the route that Darwin walked, starting at the Weatherboard Inn and going just down past Weeping Rock. For several decades, most of that route from Wilson Park, to south of the highway, to just past Weeping Rock, has been a major tourist attraction called the Charles Darwin Walk. It is a delightful walk through Australian bushland alongside Jamison Creek. Following down a little valley and its tiny rill of water, suddenly and without any preparation through the trees which border the pathway, an immense gulf is seen at the depth of perhaps 1,500 feet beneath one's feet. And here we have an undated Conrad Martin's painting of the immense gulf at the end of the Charles Darwin Walk, showing what Darwin described in the previous slide as a view exceedingly well worth visiting. The point of view is situated, as it were, at the head of the bay, for the line of cliff diverges away on each side, showing headland behind headland, as on a bold sea coast. The class of view was to me quite novel and certainly magnificent. And here we have a photo of that same view taken in 1986. Nothing has changed in 150 years. The line of cliff diverging away on each side, showing headland behind headland, as on a bold sea coast, is still just as visible as it was in 1836. The view is still as magnificent to visitors now as it was to Darwin in 1836. Sadly, the view in 2023 is very different and very disappointing. Plant growth in the last few decades has completely obliterated Darwin's magnificent view. Requests have been made to recreate Darwin's vista by removing the recent plant growth and naming the spot shown in the 2023 view the Charles Darwin Lookout. Another thing that should be mentioned is that the entire Charles Darwin Walk was closed for several years because heavy flooding destroyed the walkways, and it was a major task and very expensive task to rebuild them to withstand future floods. The top 2/3 of the walk were reopened in April 2024, and the remainder will be reopened in 2025. The walk is a tremendous experience, especially for first-time visitors to Australia. As it happens, when you drive up to the Blue Mountains from Sydney with some first-time visitors, you will reach Wentworth Falls without the visitors having seen any of the spectacular valleys of the Blue Mountains. Your visitors can then start the Charles Darwin Walk in Wilson Park near the highway, and when the final section is reopened, they can follow the entire walk, having had a very special experience of Australian bushland, but still not having seen any valleys. Then, right at the end of the Charles Darwin Walk, they round that last corner, and just like Darwin in 1836, they are confronted with, as Darwin says, a magnificent valley that is exceedingly well worth visiting. Well, that's the hope, if the New South Wales National Parks and Wildlife Service can be convinced to do as we have suggested. Now back to Darwin in 1836. Having seen the magnificent view, Darwin retraced his steps back to the Wedderboard Inn, hopped on his horse and rode on to Blackheath. The Blackheath is a very comfortable inn kept by an old soldier. It reminded me of the inns in North Wales. Here is the inn at Blackheath as it was when Darwin visited, except for the two-storey building on the right, which was built decades later. The Scotch Thistle, as it was called, had opened in 1831, just 5 years before Darwin's visit. The owner and licensee was Andrew Gardner. Interestingly, although Darwin was obviously led to believe, probably by Gardner himself, that he, that is Gardner, was an old soldier, Gardner was actually an ex-convict. Like many others who had been transported to the colony for crimes in England, Gardner had flourished after serving his sentence. In Gardner's case, just 4 years after completing his sentence of 7 years, he was granted 20 acres, that's about 8 hectares of land at Blackheath to build a hotel. When he died many years later, he owned not only the hotel and the land on which it was built, but also substantial grazing lands west of the Blue Mountains. Here is a modern view of the front of what is now called Gardner's Inn, with its sign declaring that it was built in 1831 and rebuilt in 1938. It was during that rebuilding that the original building in which Darwin stayed was demolished. Although we cannot experience the actual building in which Darwin stayed, The current building contains many reminders of Darwin's visit here in 1836. It even has a plaque recording Darwin's visit, unveiled in 2009, 2 days after Darwin's 200th birthday. 18th. Very early in the morning, I walked about 3 miles to see Govert's Leap. Here's a map showing where Darwin walked that next morning to see the view at Govert's Leap. As this plaque explains, the fall of water was named Govert's Leap from the circumstance of William Romain Govert, assistant surveyor, first having come across the spot in June 1831. So Govert's Leap is actually a waterfall. As it happens, the waterfall is not very spectacular, but the view of the valley from the cliff face is spectacular. As Darwin writes, this was a view of a similar, but even perhaps more stupendous character than that of the weatherboard. And here we have a modern wide-angle photograph of that stupendous view. In his diary, Darwin continues, Mr. Martins, who was formerly in the Beagle and now resides in Sydney, has made striking and beautiful pictures from these two views. The two Martins views to which Darwin refers are the view near the weatherboard inn and this view. Fortunately for us, Martins kept an account of the pictures he painted from his arrival in Sydney in 1835. Here is the first page of that list. Here is the entry for the view at Govert's Leap, dated August the 6th, 1835. And here is the entry for the view near the weatherboard with the same date. Notice also that immediately above the two views that Darwin mentioned is a painting entitled View of Sydney Harbour. This could be the second Martins painting that we saw earlier. Finally, it is interesting to note the uppercase letter E against the last three paintings on this slide, with the vertical explanation sent to England. This implies that the two views mentioned by Darwin were sent to England. We have never been able to locate any Martins painting of the Govert's Leap view. Perhaps a Martins painting of the Govert's Leap view is hanging on a wall in a house somewhere in England. If anyone knows where it is, please contact us. The view at the weatherboard included early in this presentation is probably not the one mentioned here, but we can assume it was similar to the painting included on this page. Finally, it is worth mentioning that, from his diary entry that we've just read, Darwin had obviously seen these two paintings during the Beagle's stay in Sydney. As we shall see later, Darwin records visiting Martins in his studio in Sydney. It's now Monday, the 18th of January, 1836. After walking to see the view at Govert's Leap, Darwin walked back to Gardiner's Inn, hopped on his horse and headed west, descending from the Blue Mountains via Victoria Pass, saw some large cliffs called Hassan's Walls, before taking a detour to a sheep station called Wallerawang. A short time after leaving the Blackheath, we descended from the sandstone platform by the pass of Mount Victoria. To effect this pass, an enormous quantity of stone has been cut through. The design and its manner of execution would have been worthy of a line of road in England, even that of Holyhead. Here is the Victoria Pass, as sketched by Conrad Martins on the 24th of May, 1838, 2 years after Darwin's trip. You can see that Darwin was mightily impressed with this roadwork. It had been built by convict labour under the direction of Major Thomas Mitchell, the Surveyor General of the colony, and it opened to traffic in October 1832, 3.5 years before Darwin traversed it. Darwin would have been even more impressed to know that this same roadway is still part of the main road across the Blue Mountains. As well as numerous cars, a huge number of large trucks and semi-trailers traverse it daily. Statistics for 2024 record around 11,400 vehicles per day, including around 2,200 heavy vehicles. All this on a piece of road spanning a large gap between two hills on the descent from a mountain range, constructed more than 190 years ago. We now entered upon a country less elevated by nearly 1,000 feet and consisting of granite. With a change of rock, the vegetation improved. The trees were both finer and stood further apart, and the pasture between them was a little greener and more plentiful. At Hassan's Walls, I left the high road and made a short detour to a farm called Wallerawang, to the superintendent of which I had a letter of introduction from the owner in Sydney. Darwin's detour actually follows the route of the present-day Great Western Highway, the main road west, which goes quite close to what is now the town of Wallerawang. Continuing with the diary, this place offers an example of one of the large farming, or rather sheep grazing establishments of the colony. Cattle and horses are, however, in this case rather more numerous than usual, owing to some of the valleys being swampy and producing a coarser pasture. The sheep were 15,000 in number, of which the greater part were feeding under the care of different shepherds on unoccupied ground at the distance of more than 100 miles beyond the limits of the colony. 2 or 3 flat pieces of ground near the house were cleared and cultivated with corn, which the harvest men were now reaping. Here we have a modern map showing the modern town of Wallerawang, and nearby the site of the farmhouse where Darwin stayed, which is named Barton Park on this map. Flowing very near the house is Cox's River, to which we will soon return. In the meantime, we can report that in 1979, a dam was built across the river south of the farmhouse, forming Lake Wallace, to supply water to the nearby Wallerawang power station. Here is a view of Lake Wallace, showing some of the sandstone blocks that were rescued from the farmhouse, which is now submerged beneath the lake. 19th. Early on the next morning, Mr. Archer, the Joint Superintendent, had the kindness to take me out kangaroo hunting. We continued riding the greater part of the day, but had very bad sport, not seeing a kangaroo or even a wild dog. Although having bad sport, we enjoyed a pleasant ride. The woodland is generally so open that a person on horseback can gallop through it. It is traversed by a few flat-bottomed valleys, which are green and free from trees. In such spots, the scenery was like that of a park, and pretty. Darwin's ride on Tuesday the 19th of January took him up to the beautiful Walgan Valley. At this stage of his life, the young and very active Darwin was still a keen devotee of the, quote, sport, unquote, of hunting. He had participated in many shooting parties in England and had hunted rheas in South America. As the Beagle's voyage continued, however, he gradually, to quote from his autobiography, discovered, though unconsciously and insensibly, that the pleasure of observing and reasoning was a much higher one than that of skill and sport. The primeval instincts of the barbarian slowly yielded to the acquired tastes of the civilized man. Unquote. Back to the diary. The greyhounds pursued a kangaroo rat into a hollow tree, from out of which we dragged it. It is an animal as big as a rabbit, but with the figure of a kangaroo. Note the highlighted words. Darwin is observing that the Australian rat kangaroo is the same size as a rabbit, but is built to a completely different plan, that is built like a kangaroo. We shall return to these words soon. This illustration is the first of our images by John Gould, with whom Darwin worked after the voyage. Having already established his reputation as an illustrator and cataloguer of birds, and as a talented naturalist, Gould was an obvious choice when Darwin was searching for someone to prepare the bird volume of the Zoology of the Voyage of HMS Beagle, which was published a few years after Darwin returned to England. As soon as Gould had completed this job, he travelled to Australia in May 1838 to collect specimens on his own account. One of the results of Gould's visit to Australia was the celebrated book entitled The Mammals of Australia, which contains 182 impressive coloured plates, including this one. Since Gould's visit to Australia followed so closely behind Darwin's, and in view of their collaboration in the Beagle bird volume, it seemed fitting for some of Gould's plates to be reproduced in this presentation as illustrations of the animals seen by Darwin during his Australian visit. Continuing his diary, Darwin records, "In these woods there are not many birds. I saw, however, some large flocks of the white cockatoo feeding in a cornfield. And a few most beautiful parrots. The beautiful parrots could have been the crimson rosella, the eastern rosella, and the Australian king parrot." All these beautiful illustrations come from Gould's The Birds of Australia, another book describing his Australian collections. Crows, like our jackdaws, were not uncommon. Note that again Darwin is comparing the Australian version with the version back home in England. And another bird, something like the magpie. In the dusk of the evening I took a stroll along a chain of ponds, which in this dry country represent the course of a river. In his notebook, Darwin recorded that the river was the Cox's River, which, as we have seen, flowed very near to the Wallerawang farmhouse. Here is Conrad Barton's view of the Cox's River, and had the good fortune to see several of the famous platypus, or Ornithorhynchus paradoxicus. They were diving and playing about the surface of the water, but showed very little of their bodies, so that they might easily have been mistaken for many water rats. Here is John Gould's somewhat dramatic depiction of platypus. Yet again, Darwin is observing that what we would now call the same ecological niche, namely rivers and their banks, is occupied in the southern and northern hemisphere by animals built to a completely different design. Back to Darwin's diary. Mr. Brown shot one. Certainly it is a most extraordinary animal. The mounted specimens do not convey a proper idea of the head and beak, the latter being contracted and hardened, that is, in the mounted specimens. While shooting platypuses these days is not the done thing, in Darwin's day it was quite acceptable. In any case, it provided him with an opportunity to examine one at very close quarters. The Mr. Brown who fired the shot was actually Andrew Brown, spelt without the E, who had come out to the colony from Scotland with the owner of the Wallerawang station, another Scot called James Walker, from whom Darwin had the letter of introduction. Like Walker, Andrew Brown ended up owning vast swathes of sheep grazing land, as well as a smaller block of land for his home called Coorwall, near Wallerawang. A celebration in 2024 marked the 200th anniversary of that home and its associated farm buildings, still owned and occupied by descendants of Andrew Brown. A little time before this, I had been lying on a sunny bank and was reflecting on the strange character of the animals of this country as compared to the rest of the world. An unbeliever in everything beyond his own reason might exclaim, "Surely two distinct creators must have been at work." Their object, however, has been the same, and certainly the end in each case is complete. Whilst thus thinking, I observed the conical pitfall of a lion ant. And here's the conical pit of what we now call an ant lion. And here's an Australian antlion, which is actually the larva of a lacewing. The adult lacewing female lays her eggs in dry soil, and after hatching, the larva burrows backwards into the soil, forming a conical pit into which its prey falls. Without doubt, this predaceous larva belongs to the same genus, but to a different species from the European one. And here we have the footnote that Darwin wrote in his diary. Note, the pitfall was not above half the size of the one described by Kirby. Kirby was one of the books in the Beagle's library that we saw in the plan of the poop cabin. It was one of 4 volumes entitled An Introduction to Entomology by William Kirby and William Spence, published between 1815 and 1826. Darwin's reference was to Volume 1, page 425. Here Darwin is providing the evidence to support his assumption of the Wallerawang antlion being a different species to English antlions, based on the size of the pit they dig. Now, what would the disbeliever say to this? Would any 2 workmen ever hit on so beautiful, so simple, and yet so artificial a contrivance? I cannot think so. The one hand has worked over the whole world. A geologist perhaps would suggest that the periods of creation have been distinct and remote, the one from the other, that the Creator rested in his labour. What are we to make of all this? Of course, Darwin was not the first European to notice the resemblance in adaptation between Australian and European animals. Some of the common names given to Australian animals were simply the result of early explorers and settlers recognising the similarities. But Darwin was sufficiently inquisitive to really think about the reason for them. Why would a creator bother to create 2 animals, such as the rat kangaroo and the rabbit, or the platypus and the water rat, which are so markedly different in basic design and in the way in which they bear and raise their young, but which occupy similar environments in 2 different parts of the world? Interestingly, these are the only mentions of the words creator and creation in Darwin's Beagle diary. Despite the firm conclusions that various readers have drawn from this passage, it is in fact tantalisingly ambiguous. Given that Darwin was writing the diary at least partly for the benefit of his friends and family back in England, many of whom still probably hoped that he would enter the ministry, this ambiguity may have been intentional. All we can say is that this section of the Darwin Beagle diary, often called the antlion passage, is the first time that Darwin committed questions like this to paper. Questions about creation. Questions without answers. Significant or not, Darwin's visit to Wallerawang is now commemorated in a memorial with platypus beside Lake Wallace, unveiled in 2006 by the then Governor, Professor Murray Bashir. By now some of you will be asking, why was this called Lake Wallace? We have asked this question of some local historians, but do not yet have an answer. So far as we know, the name has nothing to do with Darwin's co-discoverer, Alfred Russel Wallace. 20th, a long day's ride to Bathurst. Before joining the high road, we followed a mere path through the forest. Here we have Darwin's route in riding from Wallerawang to Bathurst. As it happens, the mere path followed by Darwin is now very nearly the same as the main road to Bathurst, the Great Western Highway. As shown on the map, it was a very hot day. In his diary, Darwin records, "This day we had an instance of the sirocco-like wind of Australia, which comes from the parched deserts of the interior. While riding, I was not fully aware, as always happens, how exceedingly high the temperature was. Clouds of dust were travelling in every part, and the wind felt like that which had passed over a fire. I afterwards heard the thermometer out of doors stood at 119 degrees, and in a room in a closed house, 96 degrees. To put these temperatures in context, 119 degrees Fahrenheit is 48 degrees centigrade, and 96 degrees Fahrenheit is 36 degrees centigrade. In the afternoon, we came in view of the Downs of Bathurst. These undulating but nearly level plains are very remarkable in this country by being absolutely destitute of a single tree. They are only covered by a very thin brown pasture. We rode some miles across this kind of country and then reached the township of Bathurst, seated in the middle of what may be described as a very broad valley or narrow plain. And here's a Martin sketch entitled Bathurst from the West, dated the 3rd of April, 1840. I had a letter of introduction to Captain Chetwode, who commanded the troops there, and with him I stayed the ensuing day. Here is an 1833 map of Bathurst showing the military barracks at the corner of William and Durham Streets. Here's a blow-up of that section of the map. William and Durham Streets are two of the main streets of the modern city of Bathurst. This map is a bit disorienting for those familiar with Bathurst because north is facing roughly at 4 p.m. Consequently, the site of the barracks is actually the northeastern corner of those two streets. Here's a modern map with north towards the top, showing the site of the barracks. The site has long been occupied by the Bathurst City Bowling Club, now surrounded by Red Rooster to the south, Hungry Jack's to the west, and McDonald's to the north. The greens on William is actually the clubhouse of the bowling club, located very near to the site where Darwin stayed. What did Darwin do in Bathurst? In his notebook he records 21st, rode about Bathurst, saw nothing, pleasant mess party. Back to the diary. The officers all seem very weary of this place, and I'm not surprised at it. It must be to them a place of exile. Captain Chetwode had attempted gardening, but to see the poor parched herbs was quite heartbreaking. Yesterday's hot wind had alone cut off many scores of young apples, peaches and grapes. It must be confessed that the season had been one of great drought, and that the country did not wear a favourable aspect, although I understand 2 or 3 months ago it was incomparably worse. I was told not to form too bad an opinion of the country by judging of it on the roadside, nor too good a one from Bathurst. In this latter respect, I did not feel myself in the least danger of being prejudiced. Despite this rather unflattering comment from Darwin, in 1949 the citizens of Bathurst erected a plaque in a park in the town commemorating Darwin's visit. And it reads, "This city was the objective and terminal point of the only inland journey in Australia made by Charles Darwin in January 1836. Which brings us to Darwin Down Under, an educational, historical, hysterical comedy play in rhyming couplets about Charles Darwin in Bathurst in 1836, written by J.T. Velikovsky. You can read all about it on JT's website. It's a rollicking romp about Darwin's visit to Bathurst and a few associated matters. The type of play well suited to school productions where students can learn about Darwin in an entertaining manner. JT has also adapted his play into a 14-minute film that can be viewed on YouTube. During his only full day in Bathurst, Darwin wrote to Captain Philip Parker King. As recorded on the Darwin Correspondence website, the original of this letter is held by the Bathurst District Historical Society. As you will recall, Captain Philip Parker King was the commander of the Beagle's previous surveying voyage. As we saw in an earlier presentation, after farewelling Fitzroy and Darwin at the start of the Beagle's second surveying voyage, King returned to Australia and settled on a farm west of Sydney. That farm was called Dunheved. In this letter to King, Darwin says, "My dear Sir, I arrived here yesterday evening, certainly alive, but half roasted with the intense heat. If my horses do not fail, I shall reach Dunheved on Sunday evening, and if you are at home, shall have much pleasure in staying with you the ensuing day." So Darwin was planning to visit King at his farm on the way back to Sydney. Back to the letter. "I shall take advantage of your note of introduction to Mr. Hughes and sleep there tomorrow night." So King had provided Darwin with an introduction to a Mr. Hughes with whom Darwin would stay the next evening. With this letter we end the story of Darwin's trip to Bathurst. In the next presentation we will follow him in his return to Sydney.